John chapter 4, a message that is probably well needed to be heard by many people today. These next few chapters of John are probably some of my favorite chapters. Just to teach out of. They're so rich. I mean, rich, so good. So, Jesus is in Samaria. It says, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had made more and had baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But he needed to go through Samaria. I'm just going to pause right there and to say this, that needed to go through Samaria. Now, what you need to understand is that the Samaritans, I forget, lots of people might watch this who aren't used to going through this stuff with me, and I don't want to miss anything important. So when the Assyrians came in 722 BC, they took the northern tribes of Israel captive. And what they did is they carried them away, and then they replaced them with people from other nations. So they knew they needed to have someone to take care of the land, right? I mean, if they just let the land go to waste, why take it over? So they brought in people to farm and to live there, and then they brought back some priests because the animals were eating people. They thought, oh, we need to bring in priests and stuff so that the gods of the land can be satisfied. But what ended up happening was there was a racially intermixed people there. Part of these other nations that the Assyrians brought, part Jewish. Also, the religion became intermixed. They still believed in much of what the Jews believed, and yet they mixed it up with some of the other beliefs of the other groups. And so, in the book of Joshua, when they come in conquering in Canaan, they go to the town of Shechem, and there's a lot of stories from Shechem. And from there are these two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Joshua was told to have people stand on Gerizim, and they were going to pronounce blessings. And then over on Mount Ebal, they were going to pronounce the curses if the people did not obey. The greatest of which was that God would have them cast out of the land. There was an altar on Mount Ebal. I'm getting into extra details you might not need to know. But Gerizim is where the Samaritans started to practice their worship. And they are still today, whatever day you hear this, today are still offering sacrifices. The Samaritans are a very small group of people today. Very small. Only a few hundred, I believe. But they still practice sacrifice, and they still practice it on Mount Gerizim. Now, there's lots of other stuff in there. Jacob built a well on Gerizim. There's other stories that take place on this famous mountain. But the Jews hated the Samaritans. The Jews were, in fact, quite racist. They didn't like the Romans. They didn't like any Gentiles. In fact, if you weren't Jewish, you were a Gentile. You were anything other than a Jew. But even below the Gentiles were the Samaritans, because they were half-breeds. They had taken and they had defiled the Jewish religion. And so the Jews hated Samaritans. And so much so, they would walk around the area of Samaria. Samaria is like in the middle of Israel. If the Galilee is up here in the Sea of Galilee and not Bethlehem, but Nazareth, and all that's up here, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and all that's down here, Samaria was in the middle. And it was the way the crow flies. If you want to go to Galilee, you'd go through Samaria. But Jews would walk around because they despised these people so much. And yet it says in verse 4 that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. And I think a lot of people these days need to travel through Samaria some. I think if we have not been exposed to people and groups and things that we're uncomfortable with or we don't know about and we're ignorant about, I think we need to take a trip through Samaria and really expose ourselves and understand cultures and understand things. I will just testify of my testimony and even confess. I grew up in Seattle. And while it was a mixing pot of people, it made it so in many ways I was colorblind, but then it also made me ignorant about other cultures in some ways, because everyone kind of was just all together in one place, all these different colors, all these different people, all these different things. And I just remember when I first started teaching in Mattawa, how my views on immigration and on other controversial topics changed once I got to spend some time with the people of the culture. And when you start learning about lives and stories and names and faces, it changes the way you think about situations that impact these people. So it's very easy for us to look at any people group that is hurting, and there's a lot going on right now in the news. But I would dare to say, unless you've done a trip to Samaria and gone with those people and spend some time experiencing what they experience and talking to human beings who have human stories to share, it's really, really difficult for us to make any kind of a judgment call until we've got a little bit of experience with them. And so he needed to go to Samaria. Spent half my time on those 4 verses. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. Now for the Jews, the day starts, the daytime, I guess, okay, the calendar day starts at 6 p.m. It's always night followed by day. So the 12th of whatever starts at 6 p.m., and that's the night of the 12th. And then the morning of the 12th starts at 6 a.m. So the 6th hour is noon. And so he's there in the middle of the day, and a woman of Samaria came and to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Verse 8. For the disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And we've already talked about that. But now you understand that this woman even understands. People like you don't talk to people like me. People like you are disgusted by people like me. Who are you to talk to someone like me? Now, it wasn't just that she was a Samaritan, but a Samaritan woman all the more. Rabbis, which Jesus was considered a rabbi, a teacher, even Nicodemus refers to him as that. They would not be seen talking to women in public. It was considered improper. So even beyond the racial issue, there was the issue of that they would not be seen talking to women in public because it was improper for a teacher to be talking to a woman who was not his wife and whatnot. So Jesus answered in verse 10 and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Now, this phrase, living water, it's one that as Christians we hear, but historically it's good also to know. There were 2, I guess 3, lakes and streams aside, water sources. You dug a well, or if you were lucky, you would place your town or your house next to a spring. A well, you physically have to dig it, you get to the water, and the well might run dry. But typically with a spring, the water just bubbles forth, and it comes, and it comes, and it comes. You don't have to work for the water, and typically it's an unlimited supply. Yes, springs could go dry, but the idea is wells would go dry, and you'd have to dig more. And here's this picture of the gift of the Holy Spirit. It's not something you dig and work for. I'm going to get the Holy Spirit if I just keep on digging. If I keep on working hard, I'll have the supply I need for my life. But no, it's a spring. And it comes and it comes. I actually think I saw my first spring in February. I had been to the En Harod, the spring of Gideon, on the north side of Gilboa in Israel. The first time I went there, it was dry. So springs do get dry, but Israel was experiencing a lot of drought. And it was rare that it was bubbling. And I have a video of it, of the kind of the cave, and in the back of the cave you just see water bubbling up just like a fountain. And so he's asking for a drink from the well, but he's telling her, I'm offering you living water, a spring of water that comes forth and it has no end. And so I'm trying to see where we can get to. Let's go down. We won't get to the calling her husband. So verse 11, so the woman said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? So the Samaritans, they believe they have the same roots as the Jews. And she's going to talk about that, which I guess we'll get to tomorrow, about the fact that they have the same roots, but they just realize that they're just thought of as lesser people. But she's saying, but you, Jesus, you think you're better than Jacob? He dug this well. And Jesus says in verse 13, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water I shall give will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. Solomon was the wisest man to ever live. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, he who desires silver will not be satisfied by silver. There are numerous things in this life that we believe will give us satisfaction. Some are easier to identify and write off. Cars, clothes, money. I mean, any Christian knows that money doesn't bring happiness. But when we start having to settle with, but what about health? What about love? To have a spouse, to have kids. Should we put our happiness in those things? And those are beautiful things, wonderful things that I think God would desire for us to have. But that's not where we get our joy from. And if we seek joy from our spouse, we will be let down. And if we put our trust in our health, we never know what the next day might bring. If we put our faith in anything other than God, we will be let down. But Jesus says, I can give you a living water if you learn to drink it. If you learn to be satisfied and quenched by this water, it is a fountain that never runs dry. And if you can ask God to help you get satisfaction from Him alone, He can do that. And then you will never be unsatisfied. And you will never thirst again. I get thirsty, but I get thirsty for other things. And the only time I ever get thirsty for God is when I have been neglecting to drink. When I'm not drinking, I get thirsty. But it's never because the fountain runs dry. It's a fountain that boils and bubbles forth continually and forever. And so, hey, go drink from the fountain of the waters of life. Come and drink freely. It's one of the closing promises in the Bible, right? Anyone who thirsts, let him come and drink of the waters of life freely. And so, hey, you need to tell that to someone today, because there are so many thirsty people in this world, and they need to know that the water of life is freely given. God bless you guys. Have a great day.